So, what are Donald Trump, Russia, Iran, and oil prices up to again? Today, we'll look at how Donald Trump wants to help Russia, how he has already helped Russia, and how he shot himself, the United States, and European allies in the foot while helping China. And I think we can start right with China. So if you want to know more, watch this video. So let's start with the Chinese dragon. The Chinese dragon is withstanding this oil shortage better than expected. Some absolutely brilliant influencers and strategists predicted a 4D chess game against China, namely that China gets 50% of all the oil it consumes through the Hormuz Strait. So logically, this whole military operation should hurt China the most, right? Well, not exactly, because when it comes to oil globally, oil is pretty much the same price for almost everyone. Here we can see, for example, how the price of Ural oil is currently developing. It's at $100 per barrel, or how the price of oil on the West Texas Intermediate Market is developing, which is currently at $87 per barrel. So it seems that the whole world is somehow paying some money, and therefore it affects the whole world. It's not just China that's affected, because if China can't take oil from the Hormuz Strait right now, then no one can. And everyone else is looking for oil somewhere else, trying to get it from another place. China will probably actually increase imports from Russia. Russia will make a huge profit from it. But mainly, what's important here is one small difference. China is famously prepared for this scenario because China is almost paranoidly terrified that something like this could happen. China is actually oil dependent on Iran, the Middle East, Russia, and so on. At the same time, it is aware that China has some enemies and that the United States occasionally messes up the Middle East, that Israel exists, and so on and so forth. And that's why China has built up huge oil reserves. So China has storage tanks prepared for this situation. Who doesn't have storage tanks prepared are, on the other hand, the United States, and even many European countries are often not completely ready for this whole situation. So the huge strategist who went against China, Donald Trump, didn't prepare for high oil prices, didn't prepare for the possibility that the conflict could drag on while China was prepared for it. But now he's cornered, trapped in a situation called high prices, because in the United States, gas station prices have already risen by 50%, while in the Czech Republic, for example, only by 30 to 40%, so we're doing better so far. Great. However, he's trapped, he has to deal with it somehow, and he found out that in Venezuela, things aren't moving as quickly as he would like. He thought it was all some kind of computer game, that he'd just stick a flag into Venezuela and pop, 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 he'd instantly be importing a ton of oil. But the problem is that Venezuela does have a ton of oil, but it's still in the ground. No one's extracting it. The technology isn't there, the companies aren't there. American refineries aren't set up to refine Venezuelan oil. Venezuelan oil has to be mixed with other oil because it has a specific composition. So this won't help. And so he starts talking about how maybe it would be good to ease sanctions on Russia so that Russian oil could get onto the world markets. Yeah, but isn't this nonsense? First of all, it would massively strengthen Russia, but Russia was already strengthened when Trump attacked Iran. But this thing would strengthen Russia even more because Russia would be able to export to even more countries around the world. And it could, for example, ask for a higher price because right now, when it exports only to China or something like that, it has exclusive contracts, so it's probably exporting below the market price. However, what needs to be realized is that Russia is currently extracting more than it ever has before. The volumes of oil it exports are massive, and that oil, in a way, is on the market, right? China takes that oil, India used to take it, the Turks take it, the Central Asian countries used to take it, and so on and so on and so on. That oil is on the market. Because the Russians send that oil somewhere, or used to send it somewhere, it influenced oil prices. If you lifted the sanctions on Russia now and started bringing oil into Europe, it wouldn't lower oil prices. Because that Russian oil, which is being exported in the largest volumes ever, larger than before, since it was cheap and they needed to quickly patch up the budget, that Russian oil is already influencing the prices. Even though it doesn't flow to the United States, it doesn't flow to Europe, okay, but it's already influencing the prices. Because if that oil wasn't on the market, the price would be even higher. If you let that oil into Europe, if you let it into America, if you just let it everywhere, it will only lead to the Russians being able to ask for the market price, which is $80 to $100, and they won't be forced to sell it for, say, $70 or $80 to China, because China is an exclusive buyer. So this plan of Donald Trump is completely idiotic, because by lifting or reducing the sanctions, you won't achieve a decrease in the price of oil. That Russian oil, I repeat, is already on the market and is already affecting oil prices at this very moment. At this very moment, there is actually more Russian oil on the market than in the past 10 years. That's something we need to realize. So any reduction in sanctions will only lead to Russia making more money. I'm convinced that Donald Trump isn't such an idiot that he wouldn't know this. So there are two possible reasons why he's saying this. The first possibility, he's a complete Russian collaborator. Everything he's doing right now isn't about weakening China. It's not about destroying Iran, but it's about destroying Europe, about destroying the European Union. Because right now, when Donald Trump starts telling these stories about lifting or reducing sanctions, will of course lead to cheaper oil, which isn't true if he keeps telling these stories. Then in Europe, all those Orbáns, Ficos, and other idiots who absolutely don't understand how the market works will of course rise up and start saying, yeah, let's drop the sanctions, let's trade with Russia, let's give them the money, which will divide Europe. Of course, it will brutally weaken Ukraine. So what Donald Trump is doing is either total Russian collaboration, where he wants to send a pile of money to Russia, where he wants to mess up Europe, where he wants to divide it in terms of opinion, and where he wants to shower its archenemy with money left and right. At that point, the war in Iran is basically a proxy war, not against China, but a proxy war against Europe, and a proxy war in which, by the way, we are even helping the United States. The United States is effectively waging a proxy war here, and we are assisting them with the De Gaulle aircraft carrier and the British Air Force. Well, that would be unbelievable irony and a brutal stab in the back from the United States. So yeah, the first scenario, the first reason why Donald Trump would do this thing, Russian collaboration. Or the second reason, manipulation of the markets. Because right now, Donald Trump is doing some pretty tough market manipulation. For example, he said that the war in Iran is practically won, and at that moment, the price of oil dropped from 100 to 87. Donald Trump is currently saying other things, like that it's necessary to lift the sanctions, that he's considering it, and he expects that these words will bring the price of oil down a bit more, because investors won't put two and two together and will think, yeah, lifting sanctions, end of the war, we can relax a bit more. So that's the second scenario, the second reason why Donald Trump might be doing this. Whether he's aware that lifting sanctions on Russia is a geopolitical mistake, whether he's aware that lifting sanctions on Russia won't significantly lower oil prices, but whether he's aware that by saying he wants to lift sanctions on Russia, it will lower oil prices simply because he's saying it, in the sense that investors and people who have money in oil and so on will think the situation is okay, or at least better than they thought, that it will actually calm the investors. So those are the two scenarios. He's either a Russian collaborator or a market manipulator. Take your pick. Well, in any case, what's happening right now around Iran is, of course, a display of absolute chaos in American leadership. Most likely, the entire attack was clearly being talked out of by Hexit and Trump, by the military leadership, by the Navy leadership. All the people who know something, who understand something about leading a war and managing the economy, in my opinion, were either clearly telling Trump, no, this is crap, this is just nonsense, this won't work, this is dangerous. And those two idiots, Hexet and Trump, said, no, we'll do it. We'll do it because fortune favors the brave. Arvested fortuna juvat, or however they said it. Arvested fortuna juvat. So this is one of the scenarios. And the other scenario, maybe even more tragic, is that right now America is in Russian mode. And at that moment, the people in charge are afraid to stand up to the idiots Trump and Hexet, and they do everything those two lunatics want. And at that moment, of course, loyalty wins over competence. They agree to everything. They say, yes, yes, the United States is capable of doing this. It won't be any problem, oh my great leader. And then the great leader throws them into a war they're not prepared for and starts coming up with some rescue phrases, rescue actions, pulling the emergency brake and sacrificing all the sanction efforts we've been working on against Russia for 4 years. He starts patching up their budget by driving oil prices into the stratosphere, and then he starts playing games with how the sanctions should be lifted, which is tearing apart European unity. Perfect. I love it. And if I were an observer watching this from China, I wouldn't be terribly anxious about whether we'll manage with the oil or anything like that. If I were Vesla, I would keep taking Russian oil, work on alternative routes from the Middle East or other sources, enjoy my storage tanks filled to the brim with oil, and continue to massively invest in renewable resources. I would also spread propaganda in Europe and the United States about how they are useless and how they shouldn't do it, because having the advantage of being energy independent, not being connected to any pipelines from some sheikhs or some Russians, and I want other countries that compete with me, or Europe, which competes, to have this dependence so that I, as a Chinese, would be the only one who is energy independent, who did it right, and who told the others, no, don't do it, don't do it. It will end badly because I, China, want to be the superior power that is energy independent. They're heading in that direction. They're moving towards it. They're really enjoying our stupidity while we're here talking about how we don't want wind turbines on the hills and how we don't want solar panels in the meadows and how we just want nice little cars running on fossil fuels, which we can't extract ourselves. And then we mess up the places where we get those fossil fuels from. Perfect. We're geniuses, damn. What a civilization. Great. Amazing. And, oh my God, once again, I'm disappointed in the West. Amazing, wonderful job, Mr. President. Too much winning, too much. If you feel like I was shouting too much today, it's because I can't hear. I've lost my hearing. Basically, I have absolutely no idea what's going on around me. I can hear about 30% of what I normally hear. I'll be back to normal tomorrow. So, I hope it's going to be okay. That it's just some inflammation or something like that, and nothing more serious. However, all of my problems that happened are because of this crap. Yes? This thing? That's how it is. Thank you so much for watching this content. Thank you to those of you who sent donations. Another 3,000 or so came in to support this content. So, amazing, amazing support. You are amazing. And of course, if you want to support this content, here are the QR codes. Of course, you can also share the video, give it a like, or check out my other social media like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and so on. Or join the streams. See you next time. And hopefully some competent leaders will take power soon. Hello?